Mr. Ahluwalia is a highly decorated Indian icon with several honors to his credit for his service to the country, like the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian award. Prior to 1980, he was a member of the staff of the World Bank and chief of the Income Distribution Division. He is the author of Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years, and has published a number of articles on various aspects of development, including India's economic reforms in academic journals and in edited collections. He was also conferred the honoris causa Doctorate of Science by IIT Roorkee, one of India's most prestigious institutes. I would now like to invite Faculty Advisor of FIC, Saroj ma'am, to welcome sir.
Thank you, Sailakshmi. Good afternoon, everyone. I, Saroj Joshi, on behalf of Finance and Investment Cell SRCC, welcome you all for today's session. And it is giving me immense pleasure to have Shri Montek Singh Ahluwalia ji, esteemed speaker of the day with us. Thank you so much, sir, for sparing your valuable time for SRCC. And it is indeed a matter of pride for all of us to have you amongst us. Thank you so much. We all are looking forward to listen to you, sir. So I request you to kindly take over the session and enlighten us. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be here on this webinar. I mean, I've had the pleasure of visiting your college in person in the old days when you could do that in person. And now, of course, everything seems to have become work from home and online and so on. So it's nice to be using this mechanism also. You know, I'm not really sure how to structure my remarks because on the one hand, you've advertised it as something relating to my book Backstage, which tells the story of India's economic reforms. But at the same time, I see from the questionnaires and the questions that have been shared with me, that people really want to hear a lot about very contemporary things. So let me just simply say, as far as Backstage is concerned, you know, it's my account of how economic policy changed in India, sort of beginning in the early 1980s in a very gradual kind of way, more dramatically in 1991, and then that was moved very quickly for a while, but then it slowed down, but then it kind of continued. And I think one of the interesting things after 1991 is that we had many different governments. You had the United Front government for 3 years. You then had the Vajpayee BJP government, the NDA government for 6 years. And then you went back to the UPA coalition. And then that was replaced by the current NDA regime, which won the election in 2014. So we had a lot of different governments in place. And you know, one of the dominant things about the experience is that not too many things have been changed in terms of broad direction. But I think it's one of the strengths of the Indian reform that each government has built on what it inherited and didn't try to reverse it. Now, I realize that, you know, when you're in the political sphere, nobody likes to say we are continuing what you did. So the political sphere is always characterized by very sharp differences where each group describes the other group as being incompetent and that we're doing something completely different. But you know, as academics, or at least as students, you need to keep in mind that there is, in my view, quite a substantial degree of continuity, which is necessary. I mean, if India is described as constantly changing direction, it will not evoke any kind of confidence amongst investors. So it's very important that democratic politics should continue. People should be allowed to criticize their opponents. The government can criticize those in opposition. The opposition criticize those in government. And that can be a very contested space. But at the same time, we should look back and see what's happening to policy. Now, you know, I think that if you look at the policy debate, I would distinguish between three different things. One is slogans. Slogans are very important because they convey a broad picture. but they're not very informative because they don't tell you how whatever it is going to be achieved. I mean, for example, the UPA, let me start with the UPA, also had slogans. Its big slogan was initially that we wanted inclusive growth. In other words, we were not just pushing for growth, we were pushing for inclusive growth. And the idea was that if you just have growth, which doesn't lead to majority of people benefiting, you will not get political support for the policies that you're pushing. Hence, inclusive growth. But to say, I mean, others have also said the same thing. I think the NDA, when they came in, the Narendra Modi government, I mean, they had, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which is sort of like inclusive growth. It sounds good. And I think very few people would get up and say that they don't want inclusive growth. So the slogan has a certain role, but you need to decompose the slogan into two different things. One is policies. I mean, what are the policies that you are proposing which will actually achieve this inclusive growth? And the other is programs. Now, by programs, I mean government expenditure on different programs. And for example, in the case of the UPA, our view was that inclusive growth is the result of a whole lot of policies that would actually stimulate private investment, would open the economy to foreign competition, allow imports to compete with domestic products, upgrade technology, and in this way help India remain at the forefront of technology and at the same time be competitive. In the UPA II, we expanded that to say inclusive and sustainable growth. And that's because the issue of sustainability, environmental sustainability, had become very important. So it's not just a question of growth, and it's not just a question of inclusive growth. The growth must also be sustainable in the sense it mustn't do environmental damage. That's a slogan. But the question is, what are the policies that you're going to put in place, and what are the programs that you're going to put in place? Now, I think if you look at it from that point of view, the move from UPA to NDA is a move from a 10-year period when in the first 7 years of the UPA, we had very, very high growth, 8.3% per annum, which is much higher than anything that the country had ever experienced before. And in the last 3 years, we ran into problems. And if you want, we can discuss why that happened. Any economy goes through booms and busts. And the bust, I mean, if the bust happens too close to an election, bad luck for you. But you have to take the whole period to get a sense of average performance. And if you take that whole period of the NDA, with the data that we then had, the average growth rate of the economy was about 7.8% during that 10-year period. But in the last 2 or 3 years of the UPA, it had gone low. When the NDA came in, they reintroduced the idea that we must get back to high growth, which was, I think, good. It was clearly saying that, look, we too are aiming for high growth. You fellows have lost it a bit, and we're going to do better than you, which is good. And, for the first couple of years, growth did pick up. But I think what has happened during the NDA is after the first 3 years, growth began to go down. And it kept going down. Today, because of the pandemic, thing is a complete collapse. But I think we must separate the pandemic problem from the comparison of UPA and NDA, because the pandemic is a global phenomenon. It's hitting everybody. So whatever the government in power, it would have been hit, and it would have to respond to this very new challenge. So if you cut out the current year completely, and you just look at the NDA performance in the first 6 years, up to 2019-20, then its average during this period is only about 6.6%. So you had a 7.8% average during the UPA period in the first 10 years. Let me just double check that. Yeah, 7.8% in the first 10 years. In the NDA period for the first 6 years, it's gone down to about 6.6%. Now, you can ask questions. I mean, was this because some policies were wrong? Somebody has asked the question, do you think the UPA's policies were better than the NDA's policies? You know, in my view, as far as the slogans are concerned, they were not very different. Both used different phrases to describe inclusive growth. In terms of policies, maybe there was a little bit of difference, and we'll come to that. You know, in terms of programs, there really wasn't that much difference either. Because essentially, many of the initiatives that had started in the UPA and were even criticized by the NDA, like, for example, MNREGA, have become much more important. I mean, at one stage, people used to think, and many of the critics of the UPA used to think, that the MNREGA program is a wasteful program which is damaging to economic growth. And indeed, during the election campaign, many negative remarks were made about MNREGA. But, you know, over time, MNREGA has remained very important and it has been expanded. So I think some programs got renamed. You know, Swachh Bharat, for example, is another name for an earlier program that dealt with, you know, making India open defecation free. So yes, some more money may have gone here and there, but I can't say that there was a huge change in the program content of the policy. Of course, every government says that we're doing a better job than you were doing. And I mean, that's a legitimate point to make. But then you must compare that in terms of end results. I mean, did it actually produce better results? Well, if you look at growth, it didn't. I mean, as I said, for the first 6 years, the average growth rate is only 6.6%. Why did it go down? Well, I think that, you know, one or two things have been talked about, and I think they're quite relevant. One is that the demonetization experiment in 2016 was a big sudden shock, and it hurt the informal sector a lot. I personally do not think that it was worth doing, although people may have different views on that. I mean, there's no doubt that corruption was and is a problem, but I don't think demonetization solved the corruption problem. The shift to the GST was another shock. I mean, the idea of bringing in the GST was a good one. In fact, both the UPA and the NDA were saying the same thing, because the UPA wanted to bring in the GST. At that time, the BJP was not supportive. When the NDA came in, they took up the GST and brought it in. And that's fine. I mean, you know, in politics, you have to be judged by what you do in government. But I feel that the GST probably was not done as well as it should have been. And maybe it should have been better prepared so that it would not have been, would not have generated the problems it did. I mean, one of the big positives about the GST is that it generates more revenue. And this it has not done. I mean, the revenue has fallen far short of what was expected. And I think this is because of a flawed design of the GST. So you can say that as a policy, that's a critique of what actually happened. You know, I think in some areas, the signals were very clear and they were the same, wanting more foreign investment. UPA wanted more foreign investment. The NDA also willing to have more foreign investment. In supporting the private sector and believing that it's going to be a private sector-led process, there too, I think there's not much difference in declarations. I think there are problems in pushing the private sector, and I don't think that we've been able to reconcile those. The one area where I think policy has changed is in protectionism. Present government has raised import duties over a number of years in different products. I personally do not think that that's the way to go. I mean, India's duty rates are still among the highest of all the developing countries. And I personally think that what we were doing earlier, which is bringing duty rates down and allowing the system to become more competitive under the pressure of competition, is the right way to go. And there were some problems which should have been tackled, but I don't think that raising duties again, which is what we seem to be doing right now, and putting in import controls, that is, in my view, a very old-fashioned way of proceeding. And it will have a negative effect on the economy. You know, I'm disappointed that we have not joined the Regional Economic Cooperation Partnership with ASEAN. I mean, for many years, the whole idea of India opening up was one of integrating with the rest of East Asia. But this is the most prosperous part of the world. This is the part of the world that is expected to grow most rapidly. And I think we were following a kind of a policy, all governments, including the present one, were following a policy of trying to integrate with the East Asian region on favorable terms. But unfortunately, last year, when the time came to sign the RECP, the government actually withdrew and did not sign it. I think that was a mistake. You know, the idea of India being a significant power and India carrying weight, but India being unable to join trading arrangements is fundamentally inconsistent. I mean, if we're not competitive, we should find out why we're not competitive and tackle it directly. I don't think you tackle it by raising protection barriers. And you know, one of the things that the present government has said, which I think is very sensible, is that India should be part of a global supply chain. That's absolutely correct. But you know, to be part of a global supply chain, you cannot have high duties. I mean, the whole idea of a global supply chain is that you don't produce everything yourself. You bring in things from where they're cheaply produced, you add some value to them, and you export them. And the way you pose yourself to businesses as an attractive base for building a global supply chain is to say that, look, we have multiple competencies. You can bring in your stuff from wherever you want and export it to wherever you want. Just do the value addition in India. And you can't do that if import duties are very high. So I think that's a bit of a contradiction in terms. You know, I would say the biggest problem, which I think both the UPA and the NDA face, but in a way the NDA is in power now, are the problems of the banking system. You know, I don't think that India can hope to get back to a high growth rate if we don't fix the problems with our financial sector. Now, a lot of people, it has been said very often that many of the problems of the banking system started in the last few years of UPA. And that may be true in the sense that those were boom years where everything was booming, investors were rushing in to invest, and bankers were also getting carried away to lend. And it was really Raghuram Rajan, who was appointed by the UPA as governor, who started this business that, look, let's try to see whether bank lending is going to the right people. And of course, when they came up with the conclusion that there were high NPAs, it was a challenge to the system. How are you going to fix these NPAs? Now, by then, the UPA wasn't in power. It was the NDA that was in power. And it's the job of the government in power to address the question, how are you going to fix the banking system? And I don't think we've addressed it satisfactorily yet. Now, one of the basic issues here, which has been under debate for a long time, is can you have an efficient banking system which is run by the government, where 70% of the deposits are in public sector banks? You know, many people feel that public sector banks present real problems in the sense that the government doesn't give the bankers the kind of flexibility they need to make financially efficient decisions. And the bankers react to that by simply behaving mechanically. How do we handle that? Well, that's a big challenge. I mean, there are different views on it. There is a report by the PJ Nayak committee. Hello, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay. There's a report by the PJ Nayak committee which says that, look, if you can't get rid of the government should put all its shareholdings in the public sector banks into a separate corporation and then appoint top financial people to run that corporation and let them appoint people to the board. So the boards of the banks do not become government decisions. They don't go to the cabinet, etc. You know, I think this is an imaginative idea and I think it would make a difference, but I don't think it's, to my knowledge, it's not being considered right now. So the issue arises, what are we going to do to make our banks more efficient. Now, all that we've done is we've merged a few banks. Now, merging a strong bank with a weak bank doesn't produce a strong bank. It just produces a slightly weaker bank, where the merged bank develops the characteristics, the average of the two entities that have been merged. So I have problems with, I'm not convinced that we really have a workable solution to address the weaknesses of our financial system. And there's been a lot of time that has gone by since this results came out. We are now, this is the 6th year of the government, and we don't actually have a game plan that would tell us how we're going to address this problem. So I think that is a basic difficulty. Otherwise, there are many areas where India still, we are at the bottom of the range of middle-income countries. So we have all sorts of problems. But we can go into each of these individually if you like. One of the questions that was posed to me as an advanced question was, why has India not been able to achieve a big reduction in the percentage of the population below the poverty line? Well, my answer to that is that you need to really raise the growth rate quite a bit to make a significant difference on poverty. And during the UPA period, between 2011 and 2013, 2004 and 2011, we did in fact increase the growth rate very substantially. And during that period, for the first time, the number of people below the poverty line fell very sharp. So I think India can reduce the percentage of people below the poverty line. But for that, in my view, India needs to grow at about 7.6%. And the growth also needs to be inclusive. Not every 7.6% growth will have the same impact on poverty. For example, you can have a very high growth rate based on mineral exploitation, which is highly capital intensive, doesn't employ too many people. Or you can have a 7.6% growth, which is based on faster growth in agriculture and faster growth in manufacturing, which is labor intensive. Now, the two will have very different impacts on poverty. So I think what the UPA was trying to do was to achieve a high growth in the aggregate, but also to achieve a high growth in agriculture, which I think we did, because during the UPA period, agriculture did very well. And try to get more done in manufacturing that would make it competitive. I wish we had done even more than we did, but I do think that manufacturing did grow, and there was an increase in employment in manufacturing. But it wasn't an increase in what you call formal sector manufacturing. It was largely an increase in informal. And that is partly the result of our labor laws. Our labor laws, and many people will tell you, give very little flexibility to the employer to adjust the labor force of the firm in the light of competitive conditions. And when you're faced with inflexibility, people don't want to adopt labor-intensive sectors and don't want to adopt labor-intensive technologies. So I think that's a real issue. Can we have a proper reform of the labor laws? The present government is talking about it, and let's see what they do. But we're not quite there yet. Right. Now, before I conclude, let me just say that I'm sure that I'm talking here about the UPA and the first 6 years of the NDA. But what most people are worried about is that the present state of the economy looks like a complete mess. And I would say that that is true. I don't think that's due to something that the government has done. It's true across the world, because the pandemic is a completely new and unprecedented phenomenon. And global growth rates have become negative. The IMF has revised its global growth rate projections. Most developed countries are experiencing negative growth. We have not somehow recognized that this is so. There is no official estimate yet of what the growth rate is going to be, though independent analysts have more or less said that it could be anywhere like 6 to 7% negative growth, and some people say it could even be 10% negative. Now, you could say this is uncertain, we need more time, maybe the government will come up with some estimate in the near future. But a big a big decline of that order will be the first time in recorded Indian history that GDP declined by that much. And it will have consequences in terms of employment. The decline will hurt the poor much more. So my guess would be that poverty in this year would shoot up. But, you know, that is not something that we should be blaming the government for. We should be asking, are we doing the right thing to cope with this challenge? And I think that's where the debate should be. And there are debates on that also. Around the world, people are working out exactly how do you handle this problem. If people are interested in going into that question, I'd be happy to talk about it. But let me just say one final thing. You will hear a lot of people say that, you know, now that the lockdown is over, the economy is beginning to recover. Now, my own guess is that the first quarter, you probably saw a negative growth rate of 30-35% or so. And maybe in the second quarter, it will still be negative compared to the previous year, but maybe not 35%. You know, the economy will recover only slowly. And for the average of this year, we may well be 7% below last year. Next year, which is 21-22, you will see a recovery, because probably by the last quarter of the current year, that is the period January to March 2021, the economy will have got back to where it was in 2019-20. After that, of course, there'll be a recovery, but that will only bring us back to where we were in 2019-20, because for the first 3 quarters of this year, we were much below 2019-20, and 2021-22 will recover. So I would expect to see a recovery, but don't think the pace of that recovery can be continued. And that's going to be a big challenge, because the world is going to be different. It's not as if the pandemic, once it's been brought under control, will return us to the same world that we lived in before. The fact is, there are technological changes taking place, artificial intelligence, robotization, etc., which are disrupting production links and demand links everywhere. I think it's also true that the rules under which globalization works are changing. Developed countries are beginning to backtrack from their earlier commitment to running open economies. We don't know what the reaction will be. There's talk about a US-China trade war. So it's a highly uncertain global world. And how well we perform in this period will depend on whether we have chosen the right policies to deal with this situation. And this is where my earlier distinction of the difference between slogans and policies is very important. You know, a slogan like, let's say, Atmanirbhar, self-reliance, is good. I mean, who doesn't want to be self-reliant? But what is the best way of becoming self-reliant is a different question. I mean, should you become self-reliant by raising protectionist barriers? Or should you try to become self-reliant by integrating into global supply chains? Because the policies that follow from these two are really very different. Similarly, strengthening the financial system as a slogan is excellent. I mean, nobody ever says, let's weaken the financial system. But how do you strengthen the financial system? Do you strengthen the financial system by having no banking reform, but just giving liquidity to the banks? Or do you strengthen the financing system by bringing about structural change in India's financial system, which in my view would mean getting away from the excessive dominance of public sector banks, which are not subjected to the same control by the RBI, which private sector banks are subject to. So, you know, India's future, one can always say that, look, we have a lot of bright people, we have a lot of young people, and therefore we'll do well. The short answer is, a lot depends on what happens to the world. And if the world goes into a tailspin, then it's very difficult for India to do well. And we have to see whether the world will go into a tailspin. We don't know yet. But the second point is that as you see the world changing, you have to ask yourself, what are the policies you need to follow? And they may not be self-evident. And that is really where we need much more debate on what these policies should be. So I've been speaking for about half an hour, and I was told that's what I should do, and then throw it open for discussion. So let me stop at this point and invite you to make whatever comments you want.
Thank you, sir. It was indeed an enlightening discourse. So we have received a few questions from the participants who wanted to know your expert opinion on this. So the first question is, how is the economic policy of the current government different from the UPA government, and which policy do you see as more resilient?
Well, you know, it's when you say policies, I think you need to be more clear on what you mean by a policy, because governments always declare all kinds of things as slogans as if they were policies. So we, you know, I mean, my view is that both governments have similar slogans. In certain areas, they seem to have similar policies. The policies that are similar are really, it is going to be a private sector led system. We welcome foreign investment. Agriculture is very important. Everybody agrees with that. But you know, when it comes to things like how are we going to deal with the rest of the world? Are we going to become protectionist or not? There seems to be a very substantial difference. So, you know, I think, for example, the policies of the previous government did not rely on raising import duties and import controls. The policies of the present government seem to rely on that. I'm not here talking just about China. I know that China has become a very controversial thing. But, you know, if you think that China is an unfair trader, then there are ways of targeting Chinese exports as unfair competition. But when you raise a protective duty, you're really saying that everybody is an unfair trader. And that, to my mind, is not very credible.
Okay, sir. So in the next,
I think the other thing is on finance, to be fair.
yes, sir.
I mean, I don't think the UPA made it clear how they would restructure the banks. So since they're not in power, they don't have to answer that question. I mean, it's quite clear that restructuring and reform was needed. We can only therefore ask what is the policy of the present government. And there I feel that we have not put out a credible plan for restructuring the financial system. I mean, part of the problem is that, you know, with the pandemic having the effect that it has had, the non-performing assets of the banking system will shoot up. Mm. So really, I think you need a clear statement. What are we going to do? Are we going to recapitalize the banks? And are we going to reform them or just recapitalize them and leave them at more or less as they are? If you're going to recapitalize them, are we going to give up on the fiscal deficit? Or are we going to widen the fiscal deficit, because our fiscal deficit is actually quite high? And this becomes more complicated in the middle of a pandemic, because, I mean, the government hasn't actually said what it's going to do with its fiscal deficit, but the collapse of revenues at present means that either we're going to have a much higher fiscal deficit than we originally planned, independent of what you do on banking, okay? Or we're going to cut expenditure, which I don't actually recommend. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I see in the newspapers that there's constant reference that things are going to get clarified a little bit later, so that's fair enough. We have to wait and see what the policy would be. But to my mind, you know, we should by now have had a clear official statement that, look, given the pandemic, the growth rate is going to be minus something. As a result of this, revenues are going to be very low. As a result of this, either we are going to stick with the fiscal deficit, which means we're going to cut expenditure, or we don't believe we want to cut expenditure. We actually need to increase expenditure. Therefore, the fiscal deficit will be much higher. Now, if the fiscal deficit is much higher, I think you can overcome that by saying that, look, this is an unexpected development, once in a lifetime type of event, the pandemic. And we will correct for the fiscal deficit will raise your debt to GDP ratio. And we will correct for that by bringing the fiscal deficit down sharply. Now, if you're bringing the fiscal deficit down sharply, then unfortunately we no longer have 5-year plans. So we don't know what the expenditure in different categories will be in the next year or the year after or the year after that. But you need to say that, look, this is what our current planning of expenditure was. This is what the revenue is going to be. This is how much we have to squeeze the fiscal deficit. So either we're going to cut certain expenditures, or we're going to raise more revenues from taxation or something, or massive privatization. Now, for example, on privatization, I think the present government has spoken a different language from the UPA, because the UPA was not willing to say that they will actually hand over companies to the public sector companies to the private sector. But they haven't actually done it. And I'm not sure it's going to happen. So, there are a lot of uncertainties as a result, and we have to see how that plays out.
Right. Sir, so you just touched on the subject of the 5-year plans. So, the next question is, how do you envisage the evolving role of planning commission of the years from the time of your stint in planning commission to the now new center of power, which is Niti Aayog?
Well, on my view of the planning commission, I've dealt with at great length in my book, Backstage, which I hope all the people who are on this webinar will go and buy and read. So I don't want to repeat all that. I don't know what Niti Aayog does, and it's not fair for me to comment because I'm not studying what they're doing. I don't think we should have too much focus on just the planning commission versus the Niti Aayog, because all governments have to plan. The advantage of the planning commission was that it made the plans quite explicit, because it said that, look, we're going to spend this much this year, this much the next year, this much the next year, this is going to be the revenue, etc. To my knowledge, that is not being done now. And in the planning commission, we also used to say that this is what the states are going to do. That is also not being done. I mean, I'm sure somebody is making those decisions, but you keep hearing in different sectors, all kinds of plans are being announced, but we don't hear that if all these plans have to be brought about, this is what the total expenditure will be 3 years down the road. And then you have to add to that what you're going to do for bank recapitalization. And then you have to say, if you want to keep the fiscal deficit under control, where's this money coming from? I don't know whether Niti Aayog is doing it privately. They may be, but it's not in the public domain.
Okay, sir. The next question is, which sectors should the government work on and bring in reforms to improve the growth rate of the country, which has suffered a major setback because of this lockdown?
Well, let's be clear. The way to offset the lockdown is to just ease the lockdown. I mean, if you don't ease the lockdown and you do other things, nothing will happen. The government has opened up, but the problem there is, how well are we handling the health crisis? Because the idea of a lockdown was that you would use the time gained by the lockdown to plan for management of the health crisis. Now we're relaxing the lockdown and there are spikes of infection appearing in different parts of the country. This is also true in the rest of the world. I mean, where lockdowns were relaxed and then suddenly infection spiked. So frankly, you need an epidemiologist to tell you what's going to happen on the health front. But in the long run, a solution to the problem has got to be based on an effective solution to the health problem. And I hope that, with the vaccine coming in and all kinds of other things, that maybe a year from now, this will be behind us. It will take a big hit, but maybe a year and a half. And the question really is, we will have lost a lot of growth during this period. I mean, so don't think that the pandemic doesn't matter. It matters. The question is, after that, how rapidly can we grow? And that's the issue of what are the sectors, etc. I mean, it's quite clear that some sectors may be permanently badly hit. Aviation, for example, tourism. I mean, until there is a vaccine in place, tourists will tend to avoid traveling. So it's not clear what the government can do. This is a risk which the investors have taken, and the investors will be hit. We are perhaps not, we are not as dependent on these sectors as some other countries are. I mean, there are countries for whom tourism is a very big part of their economic activity. And I think they'll be very badly hurt.
Thank you, sir. And another question: a student who read the book of yours, as you said in your book, under UPA II government, a similar suggestion like Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana under BJP government came up. However,
when you say similar, what similar suggestion was that?
Sir, I need to get back to the student because I'm not really aware. The student
I think I saw that question. It's referred to what I said. That the question was that we should give subsidized grain to 75% of the population. Okay, and my view was that that's unnecessary, because the percentage of the population that actually needs assistance is not 75%. It's much less. And if you start procuring grain to give highly subsidized grain to 75% of the population, you may not be able to procure it domestically. And if you have to buy it from abroad, international prices may go up. So I think that was not a proposal of the government, that some people wanted the PDS, the Food Security Act, to extend to 75% of the population. Well, actually, it was extended to 2/3 of the population. And in my view, I say that clearly in my book. In my view, even that was not necessary. I mean, I think that, for example, by then, poverty had gone down to 20%. Now, you might say that, no, these poverty lines are too low, we should be higher. I would be quite happy to say that the bottom 40% of the country needs some assistance. I'm not clear that I would do it by giving them subsidized grain as opposed to cash. In my view, it's much better to give them cash if you can identify the group. But against that, some people say, no, you cannot tell who deserves it, who doesn't deserve it. Therefore, you should give cash to a universal basic income to everyone. I don't personally think that makes much sense. Right? But that's not the Garib Kalyan. The present Garib Kalyan Yojana, the one that is simply providing free food, it's a temporary response to the pandemic. It's for 3 months and gets extended a little bit. So I don't think there was any comparable scheme during the UPA of this time. And what you do in a pandemic is fine. I mean, in the sense that it's a huge crisis. And I'm in favor. And I think we should have done more to help the very poorest in the pandemic, even if it would have raised the fiscal deficit, in my view.
Sir, what would be the economic impact of the national education policy in the future, according to you?
Well, I've not even read it. I've just seen the newspapers that we have a national economic. I mean, look, as many people have said, these policies they're not very precise. They're very broad indicators, and it all depends on how it's actually done. I mean, right now, it's not even clear what is going to happen, for example, to this business of, up to the first 5 standards, the medium of instruction should be the mother tongue.
Yeah.
But, in large parts of the country, every school has children with different mother tongues. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to have medium of instructions for children according to their mother tongue? So how this will actually play out is not very clear in my view. And we'll have to see what they do. But it's, the most important thing on education is, are you willing to spend the money needed to get education going? Let me just tell you that for years, since the Kothari Commission, we've been saying that expenditure on education should be increased from whatever 3% of GDP to 6%.
Yeah.
That's 3 percentage points of GDP. Similarly for health, we've been saying that it should go up from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. It's another 1 percentage point increase. So the two together is an increase of 4 percentage points. I mentioned in my book Backstage that on defense, we're not spending as much as we should. So that's another 0.5%. I don't think we're doing enough on research in order to become a strong country. So another 1%. If you add up all this, you need to spend an extra 5% of GDP, at least, maybe more. At the same time, we have a fiscal deficit which is much higher than most other countries. It doesn't matter what happens to it today, the current year, but it cannot be a sustained parameter that stays out of line. So in the fiscal deficit, everybody says should be brought down. So if we're going to increase expenditure by 5 or 6% of GDP, and you're going to bring the fiscal deficit down, either you have to cut some other expenditure, or you have to raise more revenue. In my view, I mean, there are some useless schemes that we can cut, but no government has so far got up and said that here are the 30 schemes and we're just abolishing. Politically very difficult to do. And a lot of these schemes are at the state government level, not in the central government. I think on the real challenge is on the tax front. In my view, the tax ratio, the tax to GDP ratio in India is at least 5% of GDP lower than it should be. So I have said in Backstage that probably the first thing a government looking ahead should do is to appoint a high-level committee that would look at what is the structural change in taxes that would be investor-friendly, that would be in line with global practices, and that would generate an extra 5 percentage points of GDP as tax revenue. This is not something that can be left to the finance ministry or the revenue department. You need to bring in the best minds in the country. And in 1991, that's what Dr. Manmohan Singh did, because he appointed Dr. Raja Chellaya to set up the Tax Reforms Committee. And since then, since 91, Indian tax reforms have been guided by what the Raja Chellaya committee said. And that committee included some top tax accountants, people who advise businesses, economists, and others. So I think we need to do something like that. The structure of taxation in future is going to be a very complex thing, especially for an open economy with foreign investment. If you've got foreigners coming in, they have to believe that the Indian tax system is globally competitive, both in terms of rates and in terms of procedures. Now, nobody says that. In fact, they say that our procedures many people, both domestic and foreign, have said amount to tax terrorism. So, we need to listen to this and make up our mind. Why is this so? And I would give financial sector reform of the banking system, and reform of the tax system very high priority. I also think that energy reform, electricity reform is very important, but that's largely with the states, because distribution of electricity is a state subject. It's not something that the central government can do. These are the things that really make a lot of difference.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for addressing all our questions and doubts. It has indeed been a very insightful session for us, and we are grateful to you for sparing time to guide us. We also thank respected Principal Ma'am for her support, Faculty Advisor of FIC, Ms. Saroj Joshi, faculty members and participants. I now invite the Faculty Advisor of FIC SRCC, Ms. Saroj Joshi, to conclude the session.
Thank you, Sai Lakshmi. Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful and a knowledgeable session. And it was a pleasure listening to you. I felt as if I'm attending an economic class and you throw light on so many topics. It was such a wonderful thing to listen to you, sir. I don't know about others, but I'm definitely going to read the book and have more insights about all these things. I would also like to thank my FIC team for organizing the session. Thank you all the participants for being with us. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for offering to read the book. Since
I'll definitely do that. Yes.
Influence many students, if you recommend the book to your students, that'll be a good thing. For me,
right,
anyway.
Sir. Right.
Okay. Good.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.